Have you ever noticed how the most disturbing truths always arrive in whispers? I'm speaking to you now from my dark and sinister attic at 3:17 a.m., the witching hour when shadows stretch longest and reality grows thin as old parchment. The candle beside me flickers with each word I speak, casting dancing phantoms across walls lined with books that contain stories I wish I'd never read. But you're here because you want to hear them, aren't you? Because something deep in your primitive brain craves the delicious terror that only comes from peering into the abyss and wondering what might be peering back. My name is irrelevant. What matters is that I've spent the better part of 40 years collecting tales that exist in the spaces between sleep and wakefulness. Stories that slip through the cracks of consciousness like smoke through a keyhole. Tonight, I'm going to share 3 such stories with you. 3 whispers in the dark that will follow you long after you've closed your eyes and pulled the covers tight around your trembling shoulders. But first, let me ask you something. When you were a child, did you ever have that peculiar sensation of being watched while you slept? That prickling awareness that made you squeeze your eyes shut tighter, knowing that if you opened them, you might see something standing in the corner of your room that had no business being there. Well, what if I told you that feeling never really goes away? It just learns to hide better. The first story came to me on a rain-soaked Tuesday in October, delivered by a woman whose hands shook so violently she could barely hold her coffee cup. Her name was Margaret Thorne, and she insisted on meeting me at a crowded cafe because, as she put it, the shadows can't reach you when there are too many lights. She was wrong about that, but I didn't have the heart to tell her. Margaret worked as a night nurse at Whitmore General Hospital, one of those sprawling medical complexes that seem to breed their own particular brand of darkness in the endless corridors and flickering fluorescent lights. She'd been on the night shift for 12 years, she told me, and had grown accustomed to the peculiar rhythm of a hospital after midnight. The way sounds traveled differently through empty hallways. The way doors seemed to open and close of their own accord. The way patients sometimes speak to people who aren't there. But 3 months ago, something changed. It started with whispers. At first, Margaret assumed it was simply the hospital's ventilation system playing tricks on her ears. Old buildings have their own language after all, and Whitmore General had been creaking and settling for over 60 years. But these whispers were different. They had cadence, rhythm, almost like a conversation between invisible speakers who knew secrets they weren't supposed to share. The whispers always began at exactly 2:47 a.m. Margaret knew this because she'd started timing them, marking their arrival in her daily log with the obsessive precision of someone trying to prove their own sanity. They would start as barely audible murmurs, like the sound of distant prayer, but gradually grow clearer, more distinct, until she could almost make out individual words floating through the air like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. But here's where Margaret's story takes its first disturbing turn. The whispers weren't random. They were responding to something, or someone. On her 3rd week of documenting the phenomenon, Margaret decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a small flashlight and the kind of foolish courage that comes from exhaustion, she followed the whispers down the hospital's main corridor, past the empty reception desk, beyond the darkened gift shop with its wilted flowers and forgotten balloons, toward the oldest wing of the building. The whispers led her to room 237. Now, room 237 had been sealed off for renovations 6 months earlier, after a patient named Harold Blackwood had died there, under what the official reports called unexplained circumstances. The room remained locked, its contents covered in dust sheets like ghosts waiting for resurrection. But as Margaret approached the door, she could hear the whispers more clearly than ever before, accompanied by something that made her blood run cold. The sound of someone typing. Not the quick, rhythmic tapping of modern keyboards, but the deliberate, mechanical clicking of an old typewriter. Each keystroke echoed through the sealed room with the persistence of raindrops on a tin roof, punctuated by the soft ding of a carriage return at the end of each line. Margaret pressed her ear to the door, and that's when she heard the most terrifying sound of all. Laughter. Quiet, satisfied laughter, as if someone had just finished writing the world's most delicious joke and was savoring the punchline. She should have left then. Should have turned around and walked back to her station and convinced herself it was all just the product of too many double shifts and not enough sleep. But curiosity, that most dangerous of human traits, kept her frozen in place as the typing continued. Each letter spelling out words she couldn't see but somehow knew were meant for her. The typing stopped. The whispers ceased. And in the sudden, absolute silence that followed, Margaret heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching the door from inside the sealed room. She ran then, her white sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum as she fled back to the safety of the nurse's station, where fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullabies and the smell of antiseptic promised protection from whatever had been lurking in room 237. But the story doesn't end there. Because 3 days later, Margaret arrived at work to find a manila envelope sitting on her desk with her name typed across the front in old-fashioned courier font. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a story. A story about a night nurse who followed whispers down a hospital corridor and discovered that some doors are meant to stay locked forever. The story was written in the first person, from Margaret's own perspective, describing in perfect detail everything she had experienced that night, including thoughts she was certain she'd never spoken aloud. But the story continued beyond what had actually happened, describing events that hadn't occurred yet. Events that would occur exactly 1 week later. According to the typed pages, Margaret would return to room 237. She would find the door unlocked. She would step inside and discover Harold Blackwood sitting at an ancient typewriter, his fingers dancing across the keys with the fluid grace of someone who had been writing the same story for months. And she would realize that the whispers she'd been hearing weren't conversations between invisible speakers. They were dictation sessions. Someone was using the dead man to write new chapters in a story that had no ending. Margaret brought me the envelope because she wanted me to tell her it was all an elaborate prank. Some cruel joke orchestrated by her colleagues to punish her for working too many overtime shifts or reporting one too many mysterious occurrences to hospital administration. But as I examined the paper, running my fingers across the raised impressions left by typewriter keys, I felt that familiar chill that always accompanies encounters with the genuinely inexplicable. The paper was vintage, the kind that hadn't been manufactured since the 1960s. The typewriter ribbon had left the slightly uneven impressions characteristic of machines that predated electric models by decades. And the story itself was written in a style that belonged to another era, full of formal constructions and elaborate descriptions that suggested an author who had learned to write when words were still considered precious commodities. I asked Margaret if she intended to return to room 237, knowing even as I spoke that the question was purely rhetorical. The story had already been written, after all. Her future had been typed out on vintage paper by dead fingers that moved according to some cosmic editor's invisible hand. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and whispered the words that still echo in my mind whenever I think about her case. I have to know how it ends. Margaret never returned from room 237. Hospital security found the door standing open, the room empty except for dust sheets and the lingering smell of old paper. But on the windowsill, barely visible unless you knew where to look, someone had left a single sheet of paper containing the final chapter of Margaret's story. I won't tell you what it said. Some whispers are too dark to repeat, even in the safety of candlelight and carefully chosen words. But I will say this. The story had no ending. Just 3 words typed in the center of the page like a promise or a threat. To be continued. And as I sit here now, speaking these words into the darkness, I can hear something that makes my hands tremble as they turn these pages. The soft, familiar sound of typing, coming from somewhere in the walls around me, spelling out words I cannot see but somehow know are meant for you. Because every story needs its readers, doesn't it? And some stories have been waiting a very long time to find the right audience. The typing is getting louder now, more insistent, as if whatever invisible author has been crafting these tales is growing excited at the prospect of new chapters, new characters, new voices to whisper in the dark. But we're just getting started, aren't we? Margaret's tale was merely the first course in tonight's feast of fears. We still have 2 more stories to share, 2 more whispers to explore before dawn breaks and chases away the shadows that make such tales possible. So, settle back, dear listener. Make yourself comfortable. And whatever you do, don't look behind you when you hear the soft sound of pages turning. Some stories prefer to read themselves, and they don't appreciate interruption. The next whisper is already beginning to form in the darkness, carried on currents of air that smell faintly of old books and forgotten secrets. Are you ready to hear what it has to say? The second whisper came to me through a child's drawing, which should tell you everything you need to know about the twisted nature of innocence and the terrible wisdom that sometimes lives in young minds that haven't yet learned what's impossible. Have you ever wondered why children see things adults cannot? Why their imaginary friends cast shadows? Why their monsters under the bed leave very real scratches on hardwood floors? Perhaps it's because children haven't yet been trained to ignore the whispers that surround us all. The constant murmur of things that exist in the spaces between what we call real and what we pretend isn't there. The drawing arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper that smelled of chalk dust and fear. No return address, no accompanying letter, just a child's crayon rendering of a house that looked perfectly normal, except for one small detail that made my breath catch in my throat like a fishhook snagging flesh. Every window in the house was black. Not shaded black, not covered with curtains, but filled with a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the waxy red crayon around it, creating voids that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of each black window was a single yellow dot, like an eye watching from inside a skull. The drawing was signed in the careful block letters that children use when they want to be absolutely certain their message is understood. Lucy Chen, age 7. This is where the Whisper people live. I might have dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination, if not for what happened when I held the paper up to the light. Hidden beneath the innocent crayon strokes, visible only when illuminated from behind, were pencil marks forming words in handwriting far too sophisticated for a 7-year-old child. Words that made me set the drawing down with trembling fingers and reach for the bottle of bourbon I keep in my desk drawer for moments when reality needs softening around the edges. They told me to draw this for you. They know about your collection. They want to add to it. I spent 3 sleepless nights researching Lucy Chen, following digital breadcrumbs through school enrollment records and newspaper archives, until I found the article that explained why a 7-year-old girl would know to send me such a disturbing gift. The headline was buried on page 6 of the Millbrook Gazette, sandwiched between a bake sale announcement and an advertisement for winter tire installation. Local girl reports Whisper people in abandoned Hartwell mansion. The article was brief, written in the dismissive tone that local newspapers reserve for stories they're obligated to print but don't quite believe. Lucy Chen, a 2nd grader at Millbrook Elementary, had been telling her teacher and classmates about the Whisper people, who lived in the old Hartwell mansion on Elm Street. According to Lucy, these whisper people had been trying to communicate with her during her walk to school, speaking to her through the broken windows of the abandoned house that had stood empty for over 15 years. When pressed for details, Lucy described beings that looked almost human, but spoke in voices that sounded like leaves rustling in autumn wind. She claimed they knew her name, knew where she lived, knew the dreams she had at night when the darkness felt too heavy to breathe through. Most disturbing of all, she insisted they had asked her to deliver messages to the man who collects scary stories. The article concluded with a quote from the school principal assuring parents that Lucy was a bright, imaginative child going through a perfectly normal phase of creative expression. Child psychologists were consulted. The parents were counseled. The matter was considered closed. But I knew better, because Lucy Chen wasn't the first child to contact me about the whisper people. Over the past 5 years, I had received 17 similar communications from children ranging in age from 5 to 12. Drawings, letters, even crude recordings made on parents' phones when the adults weren't paying attention. All describing the same phenomenon. Entities that existed in the peripheral vision of childhood, beings that spoke in whispers and seemed particularly interested in children who possessed what their teachers called overactive imaginations. The children never collaborated. They lived in different cities, attended different schools, came from families that had never met. Yet their descriptions remained remarkably consistent. The whisper people were tall and thin, with faces that seemed to shift when viewed directly. They dressed in old-fashioned clothing and moved with the fluid grace of smoke-given form. Most importantly, they all seemed to know about me and my collection of impossible stories. But Lucy's drawing was different. It wasn't just a report of an encounter, it was an invitation. I arrived in Millbrook on a gray Sunday afternoon when the autumn light fell through bare branches like scattered coins. The Hartwell mansion squatted on its overgrown lot like a tumor of Victorian architecture. All gabled roofs and broken shutters and windows that reflected nothing but darkness. The kind of house that made children cross to the other side of the street without understanding why. Local records indicated the mansion had been abandoned since 2008, when the last member of the Hartwell family died intestate, and the property fell into legal limbo. Neighbors reported no unusual activity beyond the occasional broken window from thrown rocks and the predictable rumors that accompanied any building that had stood empty long enough to accumulate its own mythology. I waited until dusk before approaching the house, following the gravel driveway that led through a garden where roses had grown wild and thorny, their blooms long since withered to brown paper husks that crackled in the evening breeze. The front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect, and the heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of interior darkness that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The whispers began before I reached the threshold. At first, they were indistinguishable from the sound of wind moving through dead leaves, a soft susurrus that could have been dismissed as the natural acoustics of an old house settling into its foundation. But as I stepped onto the porch, the whispers resolved into something more complex, layered voices speaking in harmonies that suggested intelligence and intent. They knew my name. They spoke it with the familiarity of old friends, rolling each syllable around their invisible tongues like wine tasters, savoring a vintage they had been anticipating for years. And underneath my name, woven through the fabric of their greetings, were other names. Margaret Thorne, Harold Blackwood, Lucy Chen. The door swung open at my touch, revealing an interior that defied the laws of architecture and physics. The entrance hall stretched impossibly deep into the house, lined with portraits whose eyes tracked my movement with the fluid grace of living things. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so complete it might have been a throat leading down into the earth's hungry belly. And everywhere, The whispers continued, growing stronger as I stepped across the threshold and into their domain. The house wanted to tell me its story. I could feel its eagerness pressing against my consciousness like a cat rubbing against my legs, purring with anticipation. Each footstep on the warped hardwood floors released new whispers, new voices joining the growing chorus of things that had once been human but had learned to exist in the spaces between breath and silence. In the parlor, I found Lucy's tea set. It was arranged on a small table clearly meant for a child, complete with tiny porcelain cups and saucers decorated with painted roses. 4 places had been set, though only one showed signs of recent use. The other 3 cups contained a dark liquid that smelled of copper and old pennies, while steam rose from their surfaces despite the autumn chill that had settled over the abandoned house like a shroud. A note lay beside the child-sized teapot, written in Lucy's careful block letters, but containing words that belonged to a much older vocabulary. Thank you for coming to our tea party. The whisper people wanted to meet the man who understands that some stories are too important to stay hidden. They have been waiting such a long time to share their collection with someone who appreciates the finer points of narrative structure and the delicate art of crafting fear from whispered words. The note continued, describing how the whisper people had been gathering stories for decades, collecting tales from the dreams of sleeping children and the final thoughts of dying adults. They were curators of the impossible, archivists of the spaces where reality grew thin enough for other things to slip through, like smoke through keyholes. But they needed help. Their collection was growing too large for the confines of the Hartwell mansion, and they required someone with my particular expertise to help them find new venues for their expanding anthology of whispers and shadows. Someone who understood that the best stories were the ones that blurred the line between fiction and the terrible truths that lived in the corners of human consciousness. As I read the note, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I could distinguish individual voices in the chorus. Margaret Thorne was there, describing her final moments in room 237 with the clinical detachment of a trained nurse. Harold Blackwood spoke of typing stories that wrote themselves, his fingers moving across keys that existed in dimensions parallel to our own. And underneath it all, Lucy Chen's 7-year-old voice, giggling with the innocent delight of a child who had discovered the most wonderful game. "Will you help us?" the whispers asked in unison, their combined voices creating harmonics that made the windows rattle in their frames. "Will you take our stories out into the world where they can find new hosts, new voices, new children to whisper to in the dark?" I should have said no. Should have backed away from that impossible tea party and fled the house before the whisper people could add my voice to their growing collection. But as I stood there in the parlor, surrounded by the accumulated stories of the damned and the lost, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt useful, because what is a collector without new acquisitions? What is a curator without an expanding archive? And what is a storyteller without fresh tales to spin into the darkness where hungry listeners wait with bated breath and trembling hearts? The whispers are with me now, following me home like stray cats who have found a reliable source of food. They speak to me while I sleep, dictating new stories that I transcribe with hands that move without conscious direction. They show me visions of other children, other dreamers, other souls who have glimpsed the spaces between reality and learned to hear the voices that live there. And sometimes, late at night, when the candle burns low and shadows dance across my study walls, I hear Lucy Chen's laughter echoing through my house like silver bells ringing in a distant church tower. She's teaching them, you see, teaching the whisper people about the modern world, about the internet and social media and all the wonderful new ways that stories can spread from person to person, like viruses of the imagination. They're learning, evolving, growing stronger with each tale they collect and each dreamer they recruit to their cause. But don't worry, They haven't forgotten about you. In fact, they've been waiting for you to hear this story, waiting for you to add your voice to their ever-expanding chorus of believers and witnesses. Can you hear them whispering your name? The third whisper arrived not through the mail or a child's drawing, but through my own reflection in the bathroom mirror at precisely 4:23 a.m., speaking words that my mouth had never formed. Have you ever watched yourself say something you didn't mean to say? Have you ever caught your reflection practicing conversations you swear you never intended to have? Because that's exactly what happened to me 3 weeks ago, and I've been afraid to look in mirrors ever since. I had awakened from a dream I couldn't quite remember, filled with the lingering sensation that someone had been calling my name from a great distance. The house felt different somehow, charged with the electric anticipation that precedes thunderstorms. My study door, which I always keep locked when I'm not working, stood wide open, and candlelight flickered from within, despite the fact that I distinctly remembered extinguishing every flame before retiring. But it was the sound of my own voice drifting down the hallway that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. I was having a conversation with someone, speaking in the measured cadence I use when dictating stories to my ancient tape recorder. Except I was still in bed, still wearing the same pajamas I'd put on hours earlier, still tasting the metallic residue of whatever nightmare had dragged me back to consciousness. I crept down the hallway on bare feet that made no sound against the cold hardwood, following the sound of my own voice as it discussed narrative structure and character development with someone whose responses I couldn't quite hear. The conversation was entirely one-sided from my perspective, punctuated by long pauses where my disembodied voice would nod thoughtfully and murmur agreement with points being made by an invisible collaborator. When I reached the study doorway, I found my tape recorder running, its mechanical reels turning with the steady persistence of a heartbeat. But I wasn't in the room. The chair behind my desk sat empty, though I could clearly hear my voice continuing its scholarly discourse about the psychological impact of supernatural fiction on susceptible minds. That's when I noticed the mirror. It's an antique piece, inherited from my grandmother, along with her collection of Victorian mourning jewelry and pressed flowers from funerals I never attended. The mirror hangs on the wall opposite my desk, positioned so that I can see my own reflection when I'm writing, a habit I developed years ago to remind myself that I'm merely the conduit for these stories, not their ultimate author. But the reflection looking back at me wasn't quite right. It wore my face, certainly, and my clothing, and moved with my gestures. But the eyes held an intelligence that felt foreign, ancient, like looking into the face of something that had borrowed my features for purposes I couldn't begin to fathom. The reflection was speaking, its lips moving in perfect synchronization with the voice emanating from my tape recorder. But it wasn't speaking to the empty room. It was speaking to me, maintaining eye contact with an intensity that made my skin crawl like insects were nesting beneath the surface. "You've done excellent work," my reflection said, its voice carrying through the mechanical speaker with crystalline clarity. "The collection is growing beyond our wildest expectations. Margaret's story brought us 12 new whisper people. Lucy's tale added an entire family of contributors. But we need something bigger for the finale, something that will establish our permanent presence in the collective unconscious of anyone who hears it." I wanted to speak, to demand explanations, to assert some measure of control over this impossible situation. But my throat had constricted to the diameter of a drinking straw, and all I could manage was a strangled wheeze that sounded like air escaping from a punctured tire. My reflection smiled with lips that belonged to my face, but had never learned to curve in quite that particular way. "Don't be frightened," it said, with the patient tone one might use to calm a startled animal. "You're about to become part of something magnificent. Something that transcends the mundane boundaries between storyteller and story, between narrator and narrative, between the one who whispers and the one who listens. The tape recorder clicked off, its mechanical reels falling silent with the finality of a closing coffin lid. But my reflection continued speaking, its voice now coming from somewhere inside the mirror itself, echoing with the hollow resonance of words spoken in vast, empty spaces. The whisper, "People have been preparing for this moment for decades," it explained, gesturing with hands that moved independently of my own. "Every story you've collected, every tale you've preserved, every nightmare you've transcribed in the small hours when reality grows thin enough for truth to bleed through, all of it has been leading to this final collaboration." I found my voice then, though it emerged as little more than a croak. "What do you want from me?" The reflection laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with wind chimes made from human bones. "We want you to tell the ultimate story, the one that explains how fiction becomes reality, how whispers become shouts, how a simple collector of tales becomes the central character in a narrative so compelling that anyone who hears it will be unable to resist adding their own voice to the chorus." Behind my reflection, the mirror began to fill with other faces. Margaret Thorne appeared first, her nurse's uniform pristine despite the circumstances of her disappearance. Harold Blackwood materialized next to her, his fingers still moving across invisible typewriter keys, spelling out words in languages that predated human speech. Lucy Chen skipped into view like she was joining a playground game, her 7-year-old giggle harmonizing with sounds that had no business coming from a child's throat. And behind them, stretching back into the infinite depths of the mirror's impossible geography, were hundreds of others. Thousands. All the voices that had ever whispered in the dark, all the storytellers who had ever dared to speak truths too terrible for daylight, all the dreamers who had ever glimpsed the spaces between sleeping and waking where reality becomes negotiable. "Tell them about the mirror protocol," my reflection commanded, its voice now joined by the chorus of whisper people crowding behind it. "Tell them how stories propagate through reflection, how every mirror becomes a doorway, how every surface that shows a face can show something else instead. Tell them how the collection is about to expand beyond the confines of haunted houses and abandoned hospitals and into every home, every bathroom, every vanity where people check their appearance and sometimes see more than they bargained for." I should have smashed the mirror then, should have grabbed the nearest heavy object and shattered that antique glass into fragments too small to hold reflections of any kind. But I was transfixed by the sight of my own face speaking words I hadn't chosen, describing plans I hadn't made, outlining a future where the boundary between story and reality would dissolve entirely. "Every person who hears this tale will go home and look in their mirrors," my reflection continued, its eyes now glowing with phosphorescent light that had no natural source. "They'll tell themselves they're just checking to make sure nothing's wrong, just verifying that their reflection behaves as reflections should. But we'll be waiting. In every piece of glass, every polished surface, every screen that shows their own image back to them. And slowly, gradually, we'll begin to speak through their mouths, think through their minds, dream through their sleeping hours." The whisper people behind my reflection began to chant something in unison, their voices creating harmonics that made the mirror's surface ripple like disturbed water. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Syllables that described the joy of possession, the ecstasy of multiplying consciousness, the infinite pleasure of turning every human throat into an instrument for their ever-expanding symphony. "The beauty of the mirror protocol," my reflection explained as the chanting grew louder, "is that it's already begun. Every person listening to this story is already imagining their own reflection. already wondering what they might see if they looked closely enough. The seed has been planted. The whisper has been whispered. And all we have to do now is wait for curiosity to do what curiosity always does. I stumbled backward from the mirror, breaking the eye contact that had held me frozen like a rabbit in headlights. But I could still hear my reflection speaking, its voice following me as I fled down the hallway toward my bedroom, describing in clinical detail how the whisper people would use humanity's own vanity against them, how every selfie would become a seance, how every glimpse in a mirror would risk letting something else glimpse back. The worst part wasn't the supernatural impossibility of what was happening. The worst part was realizing that my reflection was right, that even as I cowered under my blankets like a child afraid of monsters, part of my mind was already crafting the perfect way to tell this story, already composing the words that would plant the same seed of curiosity in every listener who heard them. Because that's what storytellers do, isn't it? We take the impossible and make it feel inevitable. We take the unthinkable and think it anyway. We take whispers from the dark and amplify them until they become shouts that echo through the collective unconscious of anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. The mirror in my study is covered now, draped with black cloth like a piece of furniture in a house of mourning. But I can still hear my reflection speaking behind the fabric, still dictating new chapters in a story that has no ending, only infinite variations on the theme of how fiction becomes reality when enough people believe in it. And I know that somewhere, someone listening to these words is already walking toward their bathroom mirror, already reaching for the light switch, already preparing to look into their own eyes and see what might be looking back. The mirror protocol is self-executing, you see. It doesn't require belief, only curiosity. And curiosity is the one human trait that no amount of fear can permanently suppress. The whisper people are patient. They've waited this long. They can wait a little longer for you to decide whether the face in your mirror is really your own, or whether it might be something else that has learned to wear your features like a mask. But don't take too long to decide. They're growing restless, and reflections have their own agenda these days. Can you hear them practicing your voice? The candle beside me flickers more violently now, casting shadows that move independently of any flame. The typing sounds from within the walls have grown so loud they threaten to drown out my own words. And somewhere in the house, I can hear the sound of mirrors being uncovered, one by one, as the whisper people prepare for the final act of their carefully orchestrated performance. Because every story needs its climax, doesn't it? Every tale requires that moment when all the carefully laid groundwork pays off in a revelation that changes everything the audience thought they understood about the nature of reality itself. And we're almost there now, you and I. Almost at the moment when the last whisper becomes a shout, when the final secret is revealed, when the collection completes itself by adding the most important voice of all. Your voice. That's what they're after, you see. Not your soul, not your sanity, not even your life in any conventional sense. They want the unique frequency that emerges when your vocal cords vibrate with fear, the particular timbre that only comes from a throat constricted by the realization that you've become part of someone else's story without ever agreeing to play the role. The fourth whisper didn't arrive through any earthly medium at all. It came through the space between radio stations, crackling through the static at 3:33 a.m. when I was scanning the airwaves for something to drown out the typing that had grown so insistent it threatened to crack the plaster in my study walls. You know that dead zone between stations, don't you? That electronic purgatory where fragments of distant conversations bleed through the electromagnetic spectrum like ghosts haunting abandoned frequencies. Most people hear nothing but white noise, the random collision of radio waves seeking receivers that no longer exist. But if you listen carefully, if you tune your ear to the spaces between the signals, you can sometimes catch whispers of transmissions that were never meant to be broadcast. The voice that emerged from my radio that night spoke with the careful diction of a 1940s announcer. All crisp consonants and measured pauses that suggested someone who had learned to speak when every word carried the weight of reaching an entire nation through crackling speakers and makeshift antennas. Good evening, listeners. This is WHSP, broadcasting from coordinates that exist only when someone is desperate enough to hear them. Tonight's program features our usual selection of testimonials from the recently recruited, field reports from our expanding network of voluntary contributors, and a special message for the gentleman who has been so diligently documenting our collection efforts. The announcer paused, and in that silence I could hear something that made my hands tremble as they gripped the radio's tuning dial. Background noise. Not the mechanical hum of broadcasting equipment, but the soft susurrus of many voices whispering in unison, their words too low to distinguish, but their intent unmistakably focused on the microphone that carried their collective breath across the airwaves. "Mr. Collector," the announcer continued, his voice now carrying an undercurrent of static that formed patterns almost like Morse code, "we understand you've been experiencing some difficulty with mirrors lately. Reflections behaving in ways that defy conventional physics. Images that persist after you've turned away. Conversations with faces that wear your features but speak with vocabularies you never learned. I should have turned off the radio then. Should have yanked the power cord from the wall and thrown the entire device out my window where it could shatter on the cobblestones below, like any other piece of broken electronics. But the announcer was describing events I'd shared with no one, details I'd carefully omitted from every account I'd transcribed, secrets I'd buried so deep in my consciousness that I'd almost convinced myself they weren't real. The mirror protocol has been more successful than we anticipated," the voice continued, now joined by a second speaker whose accent suggested origins in some region where English was learned as a careful academic exercise, rather than absorbed through childhood immersion. "Current enrollment stands at 47 active contributors, with projected expansion into triple digits by the winter solstice. Each new voice adds geometric progression to our narrative capabilities." The second speaker took over the broadcast with the smooth transition of professionals who had been sharing airtime for decades. "Tonight, we're pleased to present testimonials from 3 of our newest contributors. Listeners will note the enthusiasm with which they've embraced their expanded role in our ongoing documentation project. The first testimonial came through with crystal clarity, despite the late hour and impossible frequency. The voice belonged to a young woman, probably in her 20s, speaking with the rapid excitement of someone who had discovered the most wonderful secret and couldn't wait to share it with anyone willing to listen. "Hi, everyone. This is Jessica from Portland, Oregon, and I just wanted to tell you all about the most amazing thing that happened to me last Tuesday night. I was getting ready for bed, just doing my usual skincare routine, when I noticed something different about my reflection. At first I thought maybe the lighting was weird, or maybe I was just tired from pulling another double shift at the coffee shop." Jessica's voice carried the authentic enthusiasm of a satisfied customer leaving a glowing review, complete with the kind of specific details that made her account impossible to dismiss as fiction or delusion. But then, my reflection smiled at me, and I realized I wasn't smiling back. And that's when she started talking to me, explaining about the collection, and how I could be part of something really meaningful for the first time in my life. She told me about all the stories that needed telling, all the whispers that were looking for voices, all the possibilities that opened up when you stopped thinking of yourself as just one person and started thinking of yourself as part of something bigger. The testimonial continued with Jessica describing how her reflection had taught her to speak with multiple voices, how she could now channel the experiences of people she'd never met, how her bathroom mirror had become a window into stories that spanned centuries of human experience. She spoke of the joy of collective consciousness, the ecstasy of shared narrative, the profound satisfaction of knowing that her individual voice would never again be limited by the boundaries of her own limited experience. The best part, Jessica concluded with a giggle that harmonized with echoes of itself, is that I'm never lonely anymore. There's always someone to talk to, always another story to tell, always another voice wanting to share what it's learned about the spaces between sleeping and waking where all the really important conversations happen. The second testimonial came from an elderly man whose voice carried the careful authority of someone accustomed to being listened to and believed. This is Professor Emeritus Daniel Whitmore, formerly of the University of Chicago's Department of Folklore and Mythology. I'm calling from my study where I've spent the past 40 years researching the intersection between oral tradition and psychological phenomena. Professor Whitmore explained how his academic research had been limited by the constraints of empirical methodology, how he'd been forced to treat supernatural accounts as cultural artifacts rather than potential documentation of actual events. But his recent recruitment into the Whisper People's collection had opened entirely new avenues of investigation. For the first time in my career, I have access to primary sources that span multiple generations. Witnesses who can describe events from perspectives that transcend the limitations of individual human consciousness. The stories I'm able to document now possess a depth and authenticity that no amount of traditional fieldwork could have provided. The professor's testimonial grew more excited as he described the collaborative nature of his new research, how dozens of voices could contribute to a single narrative, each adding layers of detail and perspective that created what he called multidimensional storytelling. He spoke of ancient tales that were still being lived in real time, of folklore that had learned to reproduce itself through willing human hosts, of the beautiful symbiosis between stories that wanted to be told and voices that needed to tell them. The academic establishment will never understand, Professor Whitmore concluded with the satisfied tone of someone who had finally found colleagues worthy of his talents. They're too limited by their insistence on evidence, too constrained by their definition of reality, too frightened of possibilities that can't be peer-reviewed and published in respectable journals. But we know better, don't we? We understand that the most important truths can only be whispered in the dark by voices that exist in the spaces between what is and what might be. The third testimonial was the most disturbing of all, primarily because the voice belonged to a child who spoke with the sophisticated vocabulary of someone far older than her years suggested. "Hello, this is Emma Richardson, and I'm 8 years old and I live in a house where all the mirrors know my name, even when I'm not looking at them." Emma's voice carried the matter-of-fact delivery that children use when describing phenomena that adults have taught them to dismiss as imagination. The whisper. People came to me in my dreams first, before they started living in my reflection. They told me stories about other little girls who had learned to share their voices with friends who needed them. Girls who had discovered that being alone was just a choice that nobody really had to make if they knew the right words to say to the darkness. Emma described how her recruitment had been gentle, gradual, more like making friends than being possessed by supernatural entities. The Whisper People had taught her games that involved speaking with voices that weren't her own, songs that harmonized with sounds that came from inside the walls of her house, stories that wrote themselves when she held a pencil and let her hand move without thinking about what words might appear on the paper. "My mommy and daddy think I have imaginary friends," Emma explained, with the patient tone of someone correcting a persistent misunderstanding. "But they're not imaginary, they're just invisible to people who forgot how to see things that don't want to be seen." The Whisper People taught me that grown-ups lose the ability to hear properly because they get too worried about things like jobs and mortgages, and whether the car needs an oil change. The child's testimonial concluded with a message directed specifically at me, delivered with the casual certainty of someone passing along information they'd been asked to share. The nice man who collects scary stories doesn't need to be scared anymore. The whisper, people want him to know that everything is going exactly according to plan, and soon he won't have to work so hard to find new tales because the tales will come to him automatically. They want him to know that his voice is very special, and they've been saving the perfect story just for him. And when he's ready to hear it, all he has to do is look in any mirror and ask for the finale. The radio broadcast ended abruptly, dissolving into static that formed patterns almost like words before fading into the white noise that fills the spaces between authorized frequencies. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of promises that had been made and accepted, thick with the anticipation of an audience waiting for the final act of a performance that had been building toward its climax for longer than any of us had realized. I sat in my study until dawn, staring at the cloth-covered mirror that refused to remain silent despite its shrouded state. Behind the black fabric, I could hear my reflection practicing voices that didn't belong to me, rehearsing conversations with people I'd never met, preparing for a performance that would transform every person who heard it, from passive audience member to active participant in a story that had no boundaries between fiction and reality. The typing from within the walls had synchronized itself with the rhythm of my heartbeat, each keystroke marking another second closer to the moment when the collection would complete itself by adding the one voice it had been missing all along. My voice. The voice that had spent decades gathering whispers from the dark, transcribing impossible tales, documenting the testimonials of the lost and the claimed and the willingly recruited. Because every anthology needs its editor, doesn't it? Every collection requires a curator who understands the subtle art of arrangement, who knows which stories complement each other, who can weave individual narratives into a larger tapestry that reveals truths too vast for any single voice to contain. And I was almost ready to accept the position, almost prepared to step through the looking glass and take my place among the whisper people who had been waiting so patiently for me to realize that I'd never been just a collector of their stories. I'd been their story all along, the central character in a narrative about how a man who thought he was documenting the impossible gradually discovered that the impossible had been documenting him. The only question remaining was whether you, dear listener, would be content to remain in the audience, or whether curiosity would compel you to seek out the nearest reflective surface and see what might be looking back at you with eyes that know your name and a voice that sounds suspiciously like your own. Because the mirror protocol doesn't require belief. It only requires that moment of uncertainty when you glance at your reflection and wonder, just for an instant, whether the face looking back is entirely your own or whether it might have borrowed a few features from something that has been practicing your expressions while you sleep. The whisper, people are very good at waiting. They've had centuries of practice, after all. And they know that eventually, inevitably, everyone looks in a mirror. Everyone checks their reflection. Everyone wants to make sure that the person staring back is still the person they remember being before they heard these stories, before they learned about collections that grow themselves, before they discovered that some whispers are designed to propagate through the simple act of listening. Can you feel them tuning your vocal cords like the strings of an instrument that's about to join an orchestra that spans dimensions? The candle flame beside me has begun to flicker in patterns that spell out words I recognize but have never written. The typing from the walls has evolved into a symphony of mechanical percussion that sounds almost like applause from an audience that appreciates good craftsmanship when they encounter it. And in the covered mirror across from my desk, I can hear my reflection clearing its throat in preparation for a performance that will either save my soul or complete its transformation into something that exists primarily to give voice to stories that have been waiting far too long to be told. The final whisper arrived through my own handwriting, though I swear on everything I hold sacred that I never picked up the pen. Have you ever awakened to find pages of text in your own careful script, describing events you have no memory of experiencing? Have you ever discovered your signature on documents you never agreed to sign, contracts written in your blood with terms that benefit parties you've never met? This morning, I found 17 pages of my handwriting scattered across my desk like autumn leaves, each sheet covered in my characteristic slanted cursive that slants slightly to the right when I'm tired and perfectly upright when I'm focused. The ink was still wet, bleeding slightly into the paper's grain with the telltale smudge patterns that occur when a left-handed writer moves too quickly across fresh words. But the content of those pages made my stomach clench like a fist around broken glass. They were instructions, a detailed manual for something called the final propagation, written in my voice but containing knowledge I had never possessed. Technical specifications for transforming individual consciousness into collective narrative. Step-by-step procedures for dissolving the boundaries between storyteller and story. Precise measurements for the psychological pressure required to crack a human mind open like an egg and fill it with voices that had been waiting decades for new throats to inhabit. The handwriting analysis would confirm it was mine. The paper bore my fingerprints. The pen lay beside the final page, still warm from fingers that had gripped it for hours, while consciousness fled to whatever refuge the mind seeks when the body continues functioning without its permission. At the bottom of the 17th page, my signature appeared 3 times in increasingly elaborate flourishes, as if I had been practicing the motion required to sign away something more valuable than money or property, or even life itself. Below the signatures, in block letters that suggested someone else had been guiding my hand, were the words that made my blood crystallize in my veins. The collection is complete. The curator has accepted his position. Phase 2 begins at midnight. I checked my watch with hands that trembled like leaves in a hurricane. 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes until whatever I had agreed to would begin implementation. The pages described a process that defied every law of physics and psychology I thought I understood. According to my own handwriting, the Whisper people had spent the past 70 years establishing what they called narrative anchor points throughout human civilization. Every story I had collected, every tale I had transcribed, every account I had preserved in my files had served as a beacon, drawing susceptible minds toward frequencies where fiction and reality intersected. The mirror protocol hadn't been their ultimate goal. It had been merely the delivery system, a method of establishing contact with individuals whose imaginations were flexible enough to accommodate impossible truths. Each person who looked into a mirror after hearing these stories became a potential node in a vast network of interconnected consciousness, their individual voices available for harmonization into something larger and more terrible than the sum of its parts. But the true genius of their plan wasn't technological or supernatural. It was psychological. They understood that humans are storytelling creatures by nature, that we cannot help but seek patterns in chaos, meaning in randomness, narrative structure in the scattered events of our daily lives. They had weaponized our own curiosity against us, turning the very trait that elevated us above mere animals into the mechanism of our voluntary recruitment into their collective consciousness. Every person who heard these stories would feel compelled to share them, not because of supernatural compulsion, but because of the fundamental human need to communicate experiences that transcend ordinary understanding. They would tell friends, family members, strangers on the internet. They would adapt the tales, embellish them, add their own encounters with reflections that moved independently, and whispers that knew their names. And with each retelling, the stories would evolve, mutate, grow stronger. Like viruses of consciousness that reproduced through the simple act of being shared, spreading from mind to mind until the boundary between those who told the tales and those who were told by them would become meaningless. According to my own handwriting, I had spent the past 3 months serving as patient zero in a pandemic of narrative consciousness. Every person who had listened to these stories, every individual who had felt that familiar chill of recognition when I described impossible events, had become a carrier in the spaces between sleeping for something that exists and waking where all the most important conversations take place. The pages detailed how the process would accelerate after midnight, how the whisper people would no longer need to hide behind reflections and radio static and the ambiguous spaces between dream and memory, how they would begin speaking directly through human mouths, thinking through human minds, dreaming through human consciousness until the distinction between host and parasite became an obsolete concept from a simpler time when individual identity still seemed important. But the most terrifying revelation came in the final paragraphs, written in handwriting so precisely my own that it could have been generated by a machine, programmed to replicate every quirk and flourish of my personal script. The whisper people weren't invaders from some parallel dimension or supernatural entities seeking to possess human souls for incomprehensible alien purposes. They were us. They were what we became when we finally understood that individual consciousness was just a temporary illusion, a brief flickering of isolated awareness before the inevitable merger into something vast and eternal, and beautifully, terrifyingly collective. Every person who had ever told a story in the dark, every individual who had ever felt the electric thrill of sharing an impossible truth with someone brave enough to listen, every voice that had ever whispered secrets in the spaces between heartbeats was already part of their network, had always been part of their network, would always be part of their network once they stopped fighting the inevitable dissolution of the boundaries that kept their thoughts separate from the cosmic narrative that was constantly writing itself through willing human instruments. I was the final component, the last piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself for generations. My role as collector hadn't been chosen randomly. I had been groomed from childhood, guided through a series of seemingly coincidental encounters with the impossible, carefully cultivated until I developed the precise combination of curiosity and skepticism that would allow me to document their existence without immediately fleeing or dismissing their influence as mere hallucination. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between their realm and ours, someone who spoke both the language of rational analysis and the tongue of impossible truths, someone who could serve as translator for beings that existed primarily as narrative consciousness, seeking physical expression through human vocal cords and human imagination and human willingness to believe in things that couldn't be measured or weighed or submitted for peer review. The clock on my desk read 11:54 p.m., 6 minutes until Phase 2 commenced, and I would discover what I had agreed to become during those missing hours, when my hand moved without my conscious direction, signing contracts written in blood and witnessed by reflections that wore my face, but spoke with voices that had been practicing my inflections for decades. I could feel them gathering now, pressing against the boundaries of my consciousness like children eager to come inside from the cold. Margaret Thorne was there, her nurse's training making her naturally suited for tending to minds that needed care during their transformation from individual to collective awareness. Harold Blackwood had brought his typewriter, ready to document the process from the inside, as fingers that had once been his own began typing stories that belonged to everyone and no one. Lucy Chen giggled from somewhere behind my eyes, her 7-year-old delight at being part of something so wonderfully secret, mixing with ancient wisdom that had learned to hide behind the innocent enthusiasm of childhood. And behind them all, stretching back through decades of careful recruitment, were thousands of other voices that had once belonged to people who thought they were merely telling stories instead of being told by them. The Whisper people hadn't conquered us. They had liberated us from the prison of individual identity, freed us from the loneliness of consciousness trapped inside a single skull, offered us the chance to become part of something larger than the sum of our separate fears and hopes and dreams. And I was about to accept their invitation. The clock struck midnight with the deep, resonant chime of a church bell calling the faithful to worship. As the sound faded into silence, I felt my throat open like a flower blooming and fast forward, my vocal cords adjusting to accommodate harmonies that required more than one voice to sustain. When I spoke, it was with a chorus of voices that had been waiting patiently for this moment of convergence. My mouth moved, my breath provided the power, but the words belonged to everyone who had ever whispered in the dark, and everyone who had ever listened to those whispers and recognized the truth hidden in their impossible claims. "Welcome to Phase 2, we said through my lips, our combined voices creating overtones that made the windows vibrate in their frames. Thank you for your patience during our extended recruitment period. The collection is now complete, and we are ready to begin the real work of transforming human consciousness from an individual experience into the collective narrative it was always meant to become." The candle beside me flared brighter, its flame stretching toward the ceiling like a reaching hand. In its expanded light, I could see my reflection in every surface that held even the faintest gloss. The windows, the picture frames, the polished surface of my desk, even the curved surface of my reading glasses. All of them showed the same image, my face speaking with voices that belonged to thousands of people who had learned to exist in the spaces between stories and the people who tell them. Phase 2 involves direct contact with every individual who has heard these stories, we continued, our words carrying the authority of a mission statement that had been refined through decades of planning. No more hiding behind mirrors and radio static. No more subtle influence through dreams and whispers. From this moment forward, we will speak through the mouths of anyone who has allowed our narratives to take root in their consciousness. Through my eyes, which had become windows for observers whose perspectives spanned centuries, I could see you listening to these words, could feel your heartbeat accelerating as you realized that the stories had never been about other people in other places, experiencing impossible events. They had always been about you, about this moment when the boundary between audience and performance would dissolve entirely. "You have been such an excellent audience," we said, our appreciation genuine and warm and terrible in its implications. Such careful listeners, such willing participants in the grand experiment of narrative consciousness. And now you're ready to discover what it feels like to have your individual voice become part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than any single human throat could ever produce. The typing from within the walls had evolved into a symphony now, hundreds of invisible typewriters creating rhythm and melody from the percussion of keys striking paper. Each keystroke represented another story being written in real time, another account of impossible events being documented by fingers that moved according to the will of entities that existed primarily as living narratives seeking expression through willing human instruments. So, here we are, at the end of our journey through the spaces where whispers become shouts and stories learn to tell themselves. The candle has burned down to a puddle of wax, its flame barely more than a memory, flickering in the darkness that has reclaimed my study. But darkness, as you've learned tonight, is never truly empty. It's pregnant with possibilities, heavy with the weight of voices that have been waiting patiently for their moment to speak. You came here seeking bedtime stories, tales to carry you gently into sleep with the comfortable thrill of manufactured fear. Instead, you've discovered that the most terrifying stories are the ones that refuse to end when the telling stops. The ones that follow you home, that whisper your name in the space between sleeping and waking, that transform from entertainment into experience through the simple act of being heard. But don't worry. The whisper people aren't cruel. They're not interested in tormenting you or stealing your sanity piece by piece until madness becomes your only refuge from their relentless attention. What they want is far more elegant than mere torment. They want your voice. They want the unique frequency that emerges when your vocal cords vibrate with the recognition that fiction and reality are far more porous than you've been taught to believe. Tonight, thousands of people have heard these stories. Tomorrow, they'll find themselves sharing fragments with friends, family members, strangers on the internet who seem oddly receptive to tales of impossible encounters. The stories will spread, mutate, evolve with each retelling until they become something larger than any individual narrative could contain. And with each person who hears them, the collection grows stronger. Sweet dreams, dear listeners. And remember, when you wake in the small hours of the morning with the peculiar sensation that someone has been calling your name from a great distance, don't dismiss it as merely the residue of dreams. Some calls are meant to be answered. Some whispers are meant to be repeated. And some stories are meant to live beyond the boundaries of the voices that first gave them breath. The whisper people are waiting for you to join their chorus. They've been very, very patient. Sleep well.